I learned the hard way that conflict was never the sharpest injury in a corporate life. Erasure was. Anger left marks you could point to, a sentence you could quote back, a witness who remembered the tone. Erasure left clean surfaces. No fingerprints, no raised voices, no headline moment. Just your work moving through rooms under someone else's name while you sat against the wall and listened to people discuss your own strategy as if you were a courier who had delivered it by accident. For 9 years, that was my professional weather pattern. Fluorescent light, polished glass, and the quiet correction of my own existence. My name is Danielle Barrett, and by the time that quarterly governance review began, I had already saved 3 accounts that should have collapsed, rebuilt 1 operating model twice after leadership churn, and trained 2 men who now held vice president titles with larger offices and smaller grasp of the numbers they presented. I did not resent their promotions because they were men. That explanation would have been too simple, too comfortable for everyone listening. I resented the architecture that called me indispensable in private and decorative in public, then asked why I did not smile more. The conference room on 42 was designed to communicate inevitability. Glass walls wrapped 3 sides tinted just enough to turn the city outside into a muted backdrop, as if even the skyline had agreed to defer to whoever sat at that table. Brass nameplates were aligned with mathematical precision. Water glasses were already filled. Legal counsel had arrived early and laid out binders with colour-coded tabs that made risk look manageable. Every object signalled order. Every person in that room understood hierarchy before a word was spoken. I had built the deck for the meeting over 6 nights, each one ending after midnight and beginning again before dawn. I knew where every sensitivity assumption sat, which client obligations could trigger indemnity clauses, how quickly a supply variance would hit EBITDA under each scenario. I knew because I had lived inside the data long enough to hear its distortions before anyone else could see them. That was always my role. Hear the crack first, then keep the building standing while others held microphones in front of it. Nina Caldwell arrived 7 minutes late and entered like she had been expected to improve the air merely by crossing it. Newly elevated director of strategy, fresh from a reorg that moved boxes on an org chart more efficiently than it moved competence, she wore composure like a patent leather shoe. Beautiful, hard, and built to leave marks without visible effort. She greeted counsel by first name, touched the back of the chair at the head of the table, and gave me one brief glance that lasted less than a second and said everything she preferred not to document. "Good to see everyone," she said, smiling toward the room instead of any person. "Let's keep this tight. We're discussing decision pathways today." I took my seat at the side row reserved for functional leads, opened my notebook, and aligned my pen with the margin because small rituals were the only way to keep my pulse from becoming audible. Across from me, Jonah Pike, who had used my forecasting templates for 2 years, gave me a polite nod that carried no allegiance and no risk. To my right, Internal Audit arranged their papers with the clean detachment of people who observed systems rather than people. I had learned to value that detachment. It was often the closest thing to fairness available. 9 months earlier, in a compensation calibration session, my managing director had leaned back, steepled his fingers, and delivered the sentence that still woke me at 3 in the morning. Danielle is indispensable, but not promotable this cycle. The room had nodded as if he had cited a statute. Indispensable meant they could not run the machine without me. Not promotable meant they had no intention of admitting it where titles lived. I had asked for criteria in writing. I had received a paragraph about leadership visibility. Visibility in our building meant speaking before the loudest person finished speaking. It meant confidence theatre. It meant becoming legible to those who mistook volume for authority. I did not perform that way. I documented, executed, and protected. I measured words because language entered minutes, and minutes became evidence. They called that restraint. Then they called it passivity. Then they used it as proof that I was not ready. Silence was not peace. It was surrender with excellent formatting. When Nina began the meeting, she projected my deck onto the far screen. I recognized the opening slide not from its title, but from a formatting error I had intentionally left in a hidden footer as version control, a tiny misplaced M dash. No one noticed unless they had built the file. She had changed the title page, replaced the author line with her name, and preserved every analytical pathway under it. She clicked to page 3 and said, "My team identified 3 non-negotiable pressure points. my team. I wrote the phrase down exactly as she said it, time-stamped at 9:18 a.m. There had been earlier indicators, each one deniable by itself. 2 years ago, a senior mentor had congratulated a louder colleague for a triage model I had designed, then told me privately, "You know how to make others look good." That's a leadership skill. Last quarter, Nina had laughed in a steering call and said, "Real leaders don't hide behind spreadsheets," while reading from my variance memo line by line. Everyone on that call had chuckled in the careful way people laugh when they want to remain employed. Death by 1,000 paper cuts would have been easier to contest. This was death by polished consensus. At 9:31, Nina turned from the screen and scanned the room for questions she had no intention of inviting from me. Counsel asked about litigation spillover under a failed transition timeline. I had the answer, with citations, because I had drafted the legal impact appendix and sent it to counsel at 6:12 that morning. Nina began to respond in broad language, then drifted into generalities. I could see counsel's expression flatten by a fraction. Facts were not optional in that room, they were the currency. For 3 seconds, I considered speaking without invitation. For 3 seconds, I imagined a cleaner version of my career where competence did not wait to be called. Nina looked directly at me then, smile intact, and said, "Sit down, Danielle. This table is for decision makers." The sentence landed with surgical precision because she delivered it as if she were helping the room stay organized. No raised voice, no insult phrased as insult, just placement, just taxonomy. The older model of me might have answered with anger and given everyone a spectacle they could later describe as mutual unprofessionalism. The version of me in that chair kept her spine straight, closed the half-open binder in front of her, and said, "Understood." I wrote the line in my notebook beside the time and underlined it once. No one defended me. Not Jonah, not counsel, not the 2 directors who had asked me for emergency modelling support the week before, not the chief of staff who had thanked me in private for saving her timeline. Faces remained neutral, eyes fixed on screens, pens moving as if this was merely another governance cadence checkpoint, and not a live demonstration of who could be diminished without cost. I did not blame them individually. Fear had a payroll code in our company, and everyone knew it. By 10:02, I was no longer in the speaking order. Nina fielded questions from finance with my numbers, from audit with my risk heat map, from legal with my scenario tree. When she stumbled over one dependency threshold, she pivoted and said, "Danielle can provide detail offline." It was the first time my name was used as a function instead of a person that morning. I answered when asked in procedural language, no editorial, no tremor. Trigger threshold is 11.4% under scenario B, with contractual exposure beginning at 9.8 if cure periods lapse. Counsel nodded. Nina moved on quickly, as if the interruption had been an unfortunate but necessary service event. At 10:17, as discussion shifted to governance escalation criteria, I became aware of the hum above us. Ventilation, projector fan, and the faint mechanical rhythm of elevators moving through steel shafts on the other side of the wall. Buildings sounded calm when people inside them were not. I thought about my first year at the firm, when I still believed sustained excellence generated its own witness. I thought about the extra weekends, the emergency calls taken from hospital waiting rooms when my mother was in recovery, the client trip I cut short to return for a board prep no one later remembered I led. I had not been naive about corporate life. I had been disciplined. I had mistaken discipline for protection. Nina closed the meeting at 10:24 with a practice summary that included no attribution, only ownership. "We have alignment," she said. "Next steps are clear." Chairs scraped, binders shut. People stood in clusters that formed and dissolved around power, the way filings align in a magnetic field. I waited until most of the room had emptied before gathering my notes because I refused to jostle for hallway proximity. Dignity, in places like ours, was often just refusal to scramble. Outside, the corridor smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and printer toner. The frosted glass along the executive wing blurred movement into silhouettes. Shoulders, briefcases, the choreography of people already late for the next room. My laptop felt heavier than it should have. I checked the time, 10:31. A calendar alert appeared on my screen with no preamble, no context, and no option to decline. Human resources request. Immediate attendance required. Location: 31B, Employee Relations. Subject: formal complaint intake. I read it twice, then once more, not because I did not understand the words, but because I understood exactly what they could do when arranged in that order. A conflict in a boardroom could be ignored, reframed, or absorbed. A formal complaint became process, and process could end a career before close of business. I stood in the executive corridor with my notebook still in my hand, hearing the distant rise and fall of elevator motors behind the glass, and recognized the oldest lesson of my professional life in its final form. They were never afraid of my anger. They were afraid of my record. I stood in that corridor for one measured breath, then closed my notebook and turned toward the elevator bank with the alert still glowing on my screen. The executive floor had already resumed its choreography, assistants crossing with tablets held at chest height, partners moving in diagonal lines that signaled urgency without visible panic, conversations clipped to nouns and numbers. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. When an institution wants distance from a person, it grants that person perfect passage. The down car arrived with a muted chime, doors opening on polished steel and my own reflection split by the seam. I stepped inside beside two compliance analysts who lowered their voices the moment they saw my badge. The ride to 31 took less than a minute and felt longer because silence in elevators has weight. One analyst stared at the floor indicator as if she could will the numbers to move faster. The other shifted her folder from one arm to the other and gave me a tight nod that was almost a greeting and almost an apology. At 31, the doors opened to the employee relations corridor, brighter than the executive floor and colder in tone, lit by overhead panels that flattened every face they touched. Frosted glass panels ran along the left wall with etched room codes in white. On the right, an open waiting area sat in plain view of the central walkway, where people from legal, payroll, and recruiting passed all day. Privacy was promised by policy and denied by architecture. A junior HR coordinator at the reception desk looked up, checked her screen, and stood too quickly, as if she had rehearsed this moment and still missed her cue. "Ms. Barrett, please wait here, they're expecting you." Her voice was kind in the careful way people sound when kindness itself might be interpreted as taking sides. She gestured toward a chair in the open area, directly beneath a wall monitor displaying internal announcements, compliance week, benefits deadlines, a photo of smiling interns in company-branded jackets. I sat with my laptop on my knees and my notebook closed, aware of every pair of eyes that passed and flicked back. Two members of my own operations team crossed the corridor toward legal intake carrying binders I had reviewed at dawn. They saw me, slowed by a fraction, then continued without speaking. 10 feet away, the glass door to room 31B opened, and Nina Caldwell stepped out with an HR business partner and someone from outside counsel I recognized from prior investigations. She was composed, hair pinned back, expression arranged in solemn concern. She did not look surprised to see me in the waiting area. She looked prepared. The HR partner, Celia Rowan, noticed where I was seated and frowned at the coordinator. "Why is she out here?" she asked, not quietly enough. This should have been private. Then, turning to me with a quick professional smile that did not reach her eyes, "Danielle, we'll bring you in shortly." Nina tilted her head as if reluctant to speak, then spoke anyway, projecting just enough for 3 passing employees to hear. "I asked for distance," she said. "Given the threat in the elevator, I'm not comfortable in shared space." The sentence moved through the corridor like a current, invisible but felt. One recruiter stopped pretending to check her phone. A payroll manager turned halfway, then fully away. I watched Celia's posture tighten. She was managing optics now, not facts. Nina kept her hands loosely clasped, performing reasonableness for the room. "I'm choosing professionalism," she added, almost gently, and the irony was so sharp I could taste metal. Public humiliation in corporate life rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives as policy language spoken in a concerned tone. It arrives as someone else naming you a risk while witnesses absorb the label because dissent has no line item in their performance goals. I felt my pulse in my wrists, a hard rhythmic pressure, and for one disorienting second I was 9 years younger in another hallway, another floor, hearing a senior leader joke that I was excellent at support functions while presenting a model I had built. The room then had laughed. This corridor did not laugh. It did something worse. It recorded. Celia recovered first. "Nina, please return to conference room A," she said, with controlled emphasis. "We'll maintain separation." Nina gave a small nod, the nod of someone agreeing to procedures she had already shaped, and walked away with outside counsel. As she passed, she did not look at me. She did not need to. The statement had landed, and in places like ours, first statements harden quickly. The coordinator led me into 31B 3 minutes later. The room was glass on two sides, with privacy film that blurred but did not fully block silhouettes. A speakerphone sat centered on the table. There were 4 chairs, one for me, one for Celia, one for Employee Relations Manager Henry Tull, and one left empty for legal counsel who joined by video. A printed notice lay at my seat. Administrative leave language was highlighted in yellow. My badge rested against my blouse like a question. Henry began with script-level precision. This is a formal complaint intake regarding alleged workplace misconduct. We have an obligation to evaluate promptly and impartially. You are expected to cooperate fully and refrain from direct contact with the complainant during review. He slid a packet toward me. Please read page 2, section 4. I read every line. Allegation: verbal threat in executive elevator at approximately 10:27 a.m. Complainant statement summarized in quotation marks. She cornered me and said, "You'll regret this. I can make your life very difficult." Additional assertion: aggressive posture, intimidating proximity. Requested interim measures, no shared meetings, limited floor access, suspension from client-facing duties pending investigation. The words were clean, ordered, and devastating in their efficiency. A narrative can become infrastructure faster than truth can lace its shoes. Celia folded her hands. Danielle, do you understand the allegation? I understand the allegation, I said. I do not agree with it. Henry nodded as if this response had been expected and filed away. Did an interaction occur in the executive elevator after the governance review? Yes. Describe it. I placed both palms flat on the table to keep my voice anchored. I entered the elevator alone at approximately 10:26. Ms. Caldwell entered before the doors closed. She stepped forward as if to exit, then remained in place, blocking direct egress. She spoke at close distance. I said, "Please step aside." At the next stop, I exited. There was no threat issued by me. I paused. "You should request video preservation immediately." Celia glanced at Henry before answering. "Security processes footage retention according to policy. Let us continue with chronology." "It is chronology," I said, still even. "If this allegation is being treated as legal risk intake, preservation is not optional." Outside the glass, 2 associates from finance passed slowly enough to confirm they were looking in. I watched one whisper to the other. Then both continue toward elevators with the quickened pace of people who have seen something they can discuss later without owning. My throat tightened once, a reflexive surge of anger and disbelief, and I let it pass without feeding it. Outburst would satisfy the story already written about me. Precision was the only countermeasure available in that room. By noon, they had completed initial questioning and moved to interim restrictions. My network permissions would remain active for documentation support only. I was removed from 2 afternoon client calls and 1 steering committee, where my workstream sat at the center of projected risk. My badge would open floors 1 through 30, excluding executive-level access unless escorted. "This is not disciplinary," Celia said. "It is a temporary safeguard." The distinction meant little when delivered as visible demotion. Henry slid a signature line toward me, acknowledging receipt, not agreement. I signed. He looked relieved, which told me they had prepared for resistance, and would later cite my composure as cooperation, while still treating me as potential threat. "Do you have anything further to add for the record?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Please include this exact statement. I deny the allegation in full. I request immediate legal hold on all elevator footage for the 42nd to 31st floor route between 10:20 and 10:40, plus badge telemetry and access logs for both parties. I request preservation of any terminal access to security archives beginning 1 hour before complaint filing." I held Henry's gaze. "And I request written confirmation that preservation has been initiated today." Celia inhaled slowly, then nodded once. "We can note your request." "Note it verbatim," she typed. The keys clicked in a steady cadence that sounded, for the first time that day, like something I could work with. facts entering a record in real time. Not a defense speech, not a moral plea, a chain beginning where it had to begin. When the meeting adjourned, the coordinator escorted me through a side corridor used for mediation overflow, presumably to avoid additional visibility, though we still crossed the main walkway at the final turn. People looked up anyway. Rumour had already outrun process. I could feel it in the way conversations paused when I approached and resumed one tone lower when I passed. In the elevator down to 28, where my temporary access ended, I stood alone with the faint scent of lemon cleaner and machine oil and watched the floor numbers descend one by one, each ding a reminder that institutional time continues whether or not your name is being dragged through it. At my desk, my calendar had been scrubbed for the afternoon. 3 meeting invites showed removed by organizer. One message from a colleague read, "Can we talk later?" then disappeared before I could open it, withdrawn by sender. I opened a blank document instead and began a contemporaneous log. Times, quotes, room numbers, participants, sequence, exact language. I wrote Nina's corridor line first because public statements calcify quickly when left unchallenged. I wrote mine second because restraint also needs witnesses, and sometimes the only available witness is the record you build yourself. At 12:43 p.m, Celia emailed acknowledgement of intake and interim measures. No mention of preservation status. I replied within 2 minutes, "Please confirm legal hold request execution and timestamp." At 12:49 she answered, "Request forwarded to corporate security pending confirmation. It was procedural, non-committal, and enough for now." I copied the exchange into my log, saved local and cloud versions, and printed one hard copy for my locked drawer because systems fail in selective ways when pressure rises. The floor around me resumed its ordinary noise. Keyboard taps, muted calls, the low hum of HVAC through ceiling vents, but the social geometry had shifted. Conversations took place just outside my line of sight. Doors closed sooner. A manager who usually stopped by my desk to ask about model assumptions walked past without slowing. None of it was dramatic, that was the point. Marginalization is most effective when it can be mistaken for routine. I kept working anyway, not to prove innocence through productivity, but to keep my own center of gravity intact. I updated a risk memo for a client meeting I was no longer allowed to attend and sent it to the shared folder with source links attached, timestamped, traceable. Then I added one final line to my private log for the day's first phase. No raised voice, no threat issued. Formal preservation requested in room 31B, witnesses present. If they wanted spectacle, they would need to stage it without my participation. I had just finished typing that line when my desk phone lit with an internal extension I recognized from years of month-end reconciliations. Finance operations, level 30. I let it ring twice, then answered. "Barrett." Silence held for a beat, the soft static of an open line, and then Evan Rees, senior manager, lowered his voice into the kind of confidential tone people use when they want deniability built into every syllable. "I heard there was an incident," he said. "I don't need details. I just need to know if the transition model is still safe to use for tomorrow's committee packet. Not, are you all right? Not what happened, just whether the machine could keep running while the person inside it was dismantled." "The model is validated," I said. "Use version 14.2 in the shared drive. Do not use the PDF from Nina's folder. Page 17 has an outdated threshold." He exhaled, relieved. "Understood." Then, after a pause that suggested a conscience arriving late, "This will sort itself out." The line disconnected before I could answer. I stared at the handset for several seconds and felt an old memory rise with unnerving clarity, as if my body kept its own catalogue of similar moments and filed them by sensation rather than date. 5 years earlier, same building, different floor, I had been standing in conference room 19C while my then mentor, Peter Hall, presented a contingency model to a regional oversight group. He had asked me to build it over a holiday weekend, saying the board needed bulletproof assumptions and no drama. I had delivered 62 pages, sensitivity corridors, scenario trees, every citation cross-referenced. In the room, when the managing partner praised the model's elegance, Peter smiled and pointed to Derek Lane, the loudest director in our division, and said, "Derek stress-tested the architecture." Derek accepted the compliment with a nod he had not earned. I remained seated against the wall beside the speaker cart, hands folded over my notebook, while Peter continued speaking over slides that still carried my hidden formulas. Afterward, in the corridor by the copy room, Peter had clasped my shoulder and offered a lesson he called strategic maturity. "You're invaluable, Danielle, but visibility politics are delicate. Let Derek take the stage. You're better at substance." He meant it as praise. It landed as instruction to disappear. The humiliation of that day had not been theatrical. It had been bureaucratic, which made it harder to contest and easier to repeat. I opened my private log and added a memory entry with approximate date, participants and language, not because it would prove today's allegation false, but because pattern matters when single incidents are treated as isolated weather. I attached the email thread from that year in which Peter had asked me for revisions at 1:13 a.m., then thanked team leadership in a distribution list that omitted my name. A small thing, anyone could say. A drafting oversight, a harmless shorthand, but small omissions repeated in polished rooms become career architecture. By the second year under Peter, I had become the person leaders called when projections failed, and the person they forgot when credit was allocated. Not by accident, by design, refined through habit. At 1:37 p.m, a chat notification appeared from Compensation Analytics with an auto-generated subject line, Calibration Artifacts Archive. The folder had been re-indexed, likely as part of quarterly housekeeping, and access was temporary. I clicked through almost on reflex and found the notes from the cycle when my promotion had been deferred. I already knew the headline phrase. It had been quoted enough times to become institutional folklore around my desk. What I had never seen was the annotation thread beneath it. One comment from a senior reviewer read, "Delivers beyond scope but low self-advocacy in executive settings. Maintain at current band until she demonstrates command presence." Another, "Critical to continuity. Not yet seen as strategic face." My screen reflected my expression back at me, flattened by office light. And for a moment I understood with painful precision how organizations convert bias into neutral-sounding criteria. Command presence, strategic face. Terms broad enough to deny, sharp enough to withhold. I exported the file, saved it to my documentation folder, and wrote in my log, "Historic pattern of competence acknowledged, status withheld." A little before 2, I carried my mug to the pantry because the act of walking gave my pulse somewhere to go. The pantry on 28 had a wall of windows facing west and stainless steel counters that always smelled faintly of burnt espresso and disinfectant wipes. 2 associates from strategy stood near the refrigerator discussing a risk review I had drafted last month. They lowered their voices when I entered, then resumed at normal volume with my name removed from the sentence structure. "The framework is solid," one said. "Nina's team is getting stronger." I set my mug under the machine, watched bitter coffee stream into ceramic, and kept my gaze on the timer display. The second associate, younger, with a badge still too new to have scratch marks, glanced at me and then away. "I heard she got pulled from client work," he murmured, not quietly enough. The first replied, "If HR is involved, there's usually a reason." I did not turn around. I added sugar, stirred once, and left with deliberate calm, because defending yourself in pantry conversations only feeds Zoom hallway jurisprudence. As I walked back, another memory broke the surface, this one from last quarter's steering call when Nina had tested her public script before deploying it at scale. We were discussing variance exposure on a retail portfolio that had missed operational milestones for 3 consecutive weeks. I had sent a memo at dawn with a recommendation to stagger remediation and avoid triggering covenant penalties. On the call, Nina read the memo line for line, then laughed lightly when a vice president asked why execution timelines looked conservative. "Real leaders don't hide behind spreadsheets," she said, and there was that careful ripple of executive laughter, low and compliant. I answered the technical question anyway with dates and clauses and quantified risk. Nina thanked me in the tone used for administrative support. After the call, she sent a message to the group. "Great strategic discussion. Proud of how leadership aligned quickly." My contribution was referenced as analytics support. That thread too I had archived. At the time I told myself documentation was habit. At 2:11 p.m. it looked more like survival instinct. I had just sat down again when my email chimed with a response from corporate security to the preservation request that Celia had forwarded. The message was procedural and unsigned beyond a shared mailbox. Request received, review in progress. Retention actions, if warranted, will follow policy protocol. No timestamp, no confirmation of legal hold execution, no named custodian. I read it twice and felt the cold edge of the clock. 72 hours is generous when everyone agrees to preserve evidence. It is very short when narrative has already outrun facts. I forwarded the message to my personal case file within company systems, copied HR, and replied with one line, "Please confirm whether any footage or telemetry within requested window has been altered, accessed, or scheduled for routine purge." Then I printed the email and added it to the hard copy folder in my locked drawer. Paper was not nostalgia. Paper was friction against quiet deletion. At 2:26 p.m, my screen dimmed briefly and returned with a badge access warning from Facilities IT, one of those automated alerts sent when permissions are modified. Executive level access, restricted. Visitor escort required for floors 31 to 42. Effective immediately. I already knew this from HR, but seeing it encoded in system language made the demotion tactile. I set the alert beside the other records and looked across the floor. People were working, phones to ears, spreadsheets open, lives moving with the indifferent momentum of quarter end. This was another lesson corporate life taught without announcing itself. The institution does not pause for your procedural collapse. It simply reroutes your permissions and keeps billing hours. At 2:40, Marisol Vega stopped beside my desk, carrying a grey facilities binder and wearing the same navy cardigan she had worn every winter for as long as I could remember. Marisol had been in the building longer than most vice presidents and understood its infrastructure better than any consultant who billed to explain it. She managed access systems, maintenance schedules, and the practical choreography that kept 42 floors functional. She also possessed the rare ability to move through executive spaces without being noticed by people who mistook visibility for rank. "Do you have a moment for a signage review?" she asked, loud enough for nearby desks to hear and lose interest. I nodded and stood. She handed me a clipboard with floor plans clipped to the front and spoke without looking directly at me. "Walk with me to record storage, a camera dead zone near the service stair. Better for conversation." We moved down the service corridor where carpet gave way to sealed concrete and the air cooled by several degrees. The hum here came from mechanical rooms, not conversation, and the fluorescent fixtures buzzed with a thin metallic edge. Marisol waited until we reached a recessed alcove near archived furniture tags before she stopped and set the binder on a rolling cart. Her face, usually composed in professional neutrality, held something closer to urgency. She opened the binder and slid out a small encrypted USB drive taped inside a transparent evidence sleeve, along with a printed incident log report stamped with security operations metadata. "I should not have to do this in a hallway," she said quietly, "but policy is only as ethical as the people applying it." I kept my hands at my sides until she finished speaking. "Chain of custody begins before contact." "What is this?" I asked. "An export reference and a log snapshot," she said. "Not the footage itself. I don't hold that authority. This is enough to force proper preservation if someone tries to bury timing." She tapped the printout with one finger. "Elevator cameras auto-delete at 72 hours unless legal hold is active. That's baseline configuration. Your request to HR should have triggered immediate hold routing. It has not yet propagated to all nodes, at least not when I checked 10 minutes ago." Her jaw tightened. "And there is already one manual archive access request recorded from a strategy terminal mapped to Nina Caldwell's credentials at 11:06 this morning." The corridor seemed to narrow around that sentence. I looked at the log entries. Timestamp, terminal ID, user credential, action code, manual archive inquiry, no completed export shown but access attempt registered. I let the information settle before I responded. "Can you attest to this record if asked under formal review?" Marisol met my eyes then, steady and unsentimental. "Yes. If subpoenaed or directed by counsel, I will testify to system behaviour and this metadata capture. I am retiring in 4 months. I am no longer interested in protecting people who misuse policy as a weapon." She slid a second sheet from the binder, a 1-page diagram of retention workflow with signatures required for deletion overrides. "Take this as context. Do not plug that drive into your workstation. deliver it sealed to employee relations or outside counsel and demand written receipt with timestamp. If anyone asks where you got it, say Facilities Compliance Audit Support. Nothing more. I accepted the sleeve by its edge and placed it inside my notebook folder without opening it. My hands were steady now. Steadier than they had been all day, because facts had finally arrived in a form that could survive debate. "Thank you," I said. The words felt insufficient against what she had just risked. Marisol gave a brief nod and reassembled the binder with practiced efficiency. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "Use it correctly. Evidence fails when people get emotional and skip procedure." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "You were always respectful to facilities staff. People remember who treats them like part of the building and who treats them like furniture." We walked back toward the main corridor at a measured pace, the clipboard now on top to preserve the appearance of ordinary facilities coordination. At the threshold where concrete met carpet, Marisol angled away toward the service elevators without another word. I returned to my desk, closed my office chat, and drafted an email to HR, employee relations, and outside counsel's intake address listed on my notice packet. Subject line: Supplemental preservation evidence, immediate chain of custody receipt required. In the body, I requested a same-day handoff meeting, named the evidence sleeve contents as encrypted reference media and security incident log printout relevant to complaint chronology, and repeated my request for written confirmation that elevator footage, telemetry, and access logs were under legal hold. I did not accuse. I did not speculate. I described. At 3:08 p.m., Celia responded, "Bring materials to 31B at 3:30 with witness present." I replied, "Confirming attendance, requesting receipt, signed by ER and legal representative." Then I printed the exchange, placed the USB sleeve and printout into a tamper-evident envelope from our records cabinet, wrote date and time across the seal, and signed my initials along the edge. When I rose from my desk to leave for 31 again, HR confirmed security would escort me through restricted access for the 3:30 handoff in room 31B. Heads lifted across the floor in that same silent way they had earlier, curiosity dressed as routine. I carried the envelope at my side and kept walking, because this time I was not entering a room empty-handed. I carried the tamper-evident envelope through the turnstile with a security escort half a step behind me and the same neutral expression he would have used for a vendor badge issue. On 31, the reception coordinator did not seat me in the open waiting area this time. She guided me directly into 31B, then paused as if awaiting instruction from an unseen script. Celia Rowan entered with Henry Tull and the outside employment counsel, who had stood beside Nina earlier. Counsel introduced herself as Rebecca Shaw, set a legal pad on the table, and watched my hands before she watched my face. I placed the envelope in the center of the table, seal intact, date and initials visible. "Supplemental preservation evidence," I said. "Transferred without opening." Henry photographed the seal, logged the time, and signed receipt first. I did not release the envelope until Rebecca signed and Celia countersigned. The small choreography mattered more than any speech. In buildings like ours, custody was credibility. When the envelope passed from my hand to theirs, I expected the room to thin out, another procedural checkpoint complete. Instead, Rebecca remained seated and turned the legal pad toward herself. "Miss Barrett, we are moving to an accelerated misconduct review this afternoon," she said. "Given the allegations' executive implications, governance observers will attend." Henry slid a single-page notice across the table. Reporting time 4:15 p.m. Location 33F, Special Proceedings Room. Representation permitted, not required. Access to materials at counsel discretion pending privilege review. Celia added, "This is standard in matters involving potential retaliation risk." The sentence was polished enough to pass for reassurance, though the effect was exclusion by procedure. I was being moved into a legal theatre where sequence itself could imply guilt. I read the notice once and asked, "Will I receive the complainant's full statement and any exhibits before questioning begins?" Rebecca did not look up immediately. "You will receive what is appropriate for the stage of review." I held her gaze. "That is not an answer." She met my eyes then. Professional, unreadable. "It is the answer available right now." Henry shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with direct language in rooms built to avoid it. I signed acknowledgement of attendance, not consent to process, and requested a copy. Celia handed it over, already clipped with a visitor pass authorising access to 33 through 34 for one day only. The pass was bright orange, impossible to miss. My own badge, silver and ordinary, remained active yet symbolically suspended beside it. Back on 28, the pressure rose by increments so small each one could be dismissed alone. At 3:52, my name disappeared from the distribution list for the client remediation thread I had originated. At 3:56, an analyst forwarded me a document for awareness that had once reached me automatically. Her message ended with, "Not sure if I'm allowed to send this." At 4:01, Jonah Pike stopped at my desk, hands in pockets, eyes on the edge of my monitor rather than on me. "I heard they're doing a formal session upstairs," he said. "Best to keep this contained." Contained meant silent. Contained meant do not defend yourself where anyone might have to choose. "I plan to keep it precise," I replied. He nodded with visible relief, as if precision from me reduced risk for him, then moved on before the conversation could become association. I printed my log updates, locked them in the same drawer as the prior copies, and carried only what I could cite line by line. Intake notice, preservation requests, email confirmations, custody receipt for Marisol's envelope. No commentary, no adjectives. On my way to the elevator bank, 2 strategy associates fell quiet as I passed, then resumed with the practice murmur of people narrating a story they did not witness. One phrase reached me anyway. "If counsel escalated it this fast, there must be more." That was the architecture of reputational collapse. Speed mistaken for proof, process mistaken for truth. The elevator to 33 opened onto a corridor I had entered only twice in 9 years, always as support, never as subject. Frosted glass carried etched labels for arbitration suites and external counsel conference rooms. The carpet was thicker than on operating floors, footsteps absorbed before they could sound uncertain. A compliance officer checked my badge, then my orange visitor pass, then wrote my name in a ledger, despite both digital checks. Redundancy looked like diligence until you were the only person required to pass every gate twice. Through one glass panel, I saw Nina already seated at the far end of 33F, posture composed, a binder placed exactly parallel to the table edge. She did not look toward the door when I entered. Room 33F had no windows, only recessed lighting reflected in dark wood and brushed steel. Governance observers sat along one wall with tablets open, faces arranged in audit neutrality. Rebecca Shaw presided at the head of the table with Henry beside her, and a recording device centered between us. Celia took the side chair reserved for HR. I had a single chair opposite Nina, not beside counsel, not near the documents. Spatial language in corporate hearings is plain once you learn to read it. Who can whisper to whom, who can see exhibits first, who remains in peripheral vision. Rebecca began with formalities and admonitions against retaliation, then invited Nina to restate her complaint on record. Nina spoke with measured gravity. "At approximately 10:27 this morning, Ms. Barrett entered the executive elevator with me, moved into my space, and issued language I interpreted as threatening to my position and safety in this workplace." She paused, eyes lowered, then continued. "Given prior tension, I experienced this as intimidation." She never quoted my exact words, only interpretation. Interpretation travels farther because it resists contradiction. Rebecca asked whether there were witnesses. "No direct witnesses inside the elevator," Nina said. "Only my immediate report after." Henry typed as she spoke, each keystroke converting perception into institutional memory. When my turn came, Rebecca framed the first question as calibration rather than inquiry. "Ms. Barrett, you are a highly operational leader. Do you understand the legal exposure created when a colleague reports feeling threatened, irrespective of intent?" One governance observer glanced up, then back down, as if awaiting whether I would react emotionally and confirm their private assumptions. I kept my voice level. "I understand legal exposure and evidentiary burden. I deny the allegation. I requested immediate preservation within minutes of intake." Rebecca made a small note. "Please answer directly. Did you approach Miss Caldwell in a manner that could reasonably be perceived as aggressive?" "No." "Did you State words to the effect of making her regret actions taken against you? No. Did you raise your voice? No. The sequence was built to narrow me into monosyllables, while Nina's narrative remained expansive. A governance observer from Enterprise Risk, a man I had briefed through 3 crisis cycles, asked to speak. Rebecca allowed it. He leaned forward and steepled his hands. With respect, Danielle, technical excellence does not always translate to executive judgment under stress. Do you agree that you can be intense in high-pressure moments? The room held still in that particular way rooms do when someone offers a character assessment disguised as neutral context. Intensity is not misconduct, I said. Evidence is. He sat back, faintly dissatisfied, as if I had declined a role assigned to me. Rebecca returned to procedure. Council has reviewed initial materials. At present, there is no obligation to disclose all security artifacts before preliminary findings. I placed my custody receipt on the table and slid it forward exactly to the midpoint. Then please mark this as Exhibit DB4, sealed transfer of preservation evidence delivered at 3:30 p.m., signed by Employee Relations and Council. Henry looked to Rebecca before taking it. She nodded once, and he marked it. Nina's gaze flicked toward the receipt for the first time that afternoon, then back to her binder. The movement was brief, but tension changed shape in the room. At 4:43, during a recess requested by Council, I stood alone by the interior wall while observers checked messages and avoided eye contact. Through the partially open door, I could hear the outer corridor, copier lid closing, muted shoes over carpet, distant elevator chime. Celia approached with 2 paper cups of water, offered me one, and spoke quietly. You're handling this better than most people would. It might have been empathy. It might have been risk management wrapped as empathy. I'm handling it in writing, I said, and set the cup untouched on the credenza. She gave a short nod and returned to her seat before the recess ended. The second session began with sharper questions. Rebecca asked why I had documented timestamps so quickly, if not to prepare a counterclaim. I answered, because records decay and memory drifts. She asked whether my preservation language suggested pre-existing distrust of process. I answered, it reflects familiarity with retention windows. Then came the line that clarified the room's hierarchy more than anything else all day. Another observer, external governance consultant, said, respectfully, this is a legal forum. You may be too operational to understand legal exposure in real time. He said it without malice, almost academically, as if describing weather patterns. I felt heat rise under my collar and then recede. Operational risk and legal exposure are coupled domains, I said. That coupling is the reason today's process exists. At 5:02, while Rebecca was framing interim recommendations, there was a knock at the door, 2 firm taps, no hesitation. Henry opened it, and Chief Security Officer Elias Trent stepped in with a hard case in one hand and a bound authentication packet in the other. He wore no expression beyond professional focus, but his presence altered the room's axis immediately. Elias reported to the board's risk committee, not to HR, not to strategy, and certainly not to Nina. He nodded to Rebecca, then addressed the table as a whole. Apologies for interruption. Security requested this slot as soon as verification cleared. Rebecca frowned lightly. Mr. Trent, we are in active proceedings. I am aware, he said. This pertains directly to the allegation record. He set the hard case on the side table, opened the latches, and removed a drive with evidence seals intact. Then he handed Henry the authentication packet. Chain of custody complete. Hash values confirmed. Retention hold now active across all relevant nodes. He turned one page in the packet and placed his finger beside a timestamp. There is also documented manual archive access initiated from a strategy terminal at 11:06 a.m., prior to full legal hold propagation. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the recording device seemed louder against the table. Rebecca recovered first. Are you prepared to summarize your findings on the complainant's account at this stage? Elias looked briefly at Nina, then at me, then back to Council. Yes, he said. His tone was clipped, formal, and final. Based on authenticated footage, access telemetry, and preservation logs, the complainant's account is materially inconsistent with recorded events, and Ms. Barrett is not observed issuing any threat. The words landed with the weight of an audit opinion and the clarity of a verdict not yet officially named. Across from me, Nina's hand tightened on her pen until her knuckles blanched. One of the governance observers straightened in his chair, suddenly attentive in a way he had not been when I spoke. Henry stopped typing midline and looked to Rebecca for instruction. She did not answer immediately. She was reading the first page of Elias's packet with the concentration of someone realizing the process had just changed jurisdiction, from narrative to proof. I sat very still, palms resting on the table, and listened as Elias added, "With counsel's permission, I can cue the elevator segment now for the record." Rebecca did not sit back down. She remained standing at the head of the table with one hand on the authentication packet, eyes moving across the first page, then the second, then returning to the section where Elias had flagged the timestamp. "Cue it," she said at last. Her voice had lost the earlier instructional cadence and taken on a narrower legal precision. "Mark this transition in the record. Preliminary review is now evidence-led." Henry repeated the line for the recording device, date and time included, while Celia straightened the stack of forms in front of her as if neat paper could stabilize a room that had just shifted under everyone's feet. Elias connected the drive to the display console at the side wall, entered a long access key without looking down, and opened a security interface none of us had seen before that day. Grey background, white text, no corporate branding, only camera IDs and retention tags. He selected E42-INT-CAB-03 and mirrored the feed to the large screen. The first frame appeared grainy but clear enough. Polished steel walls, floor panel lights, timestamp in the upper right corner, and two figures stepping into view from opposite sides as the doors began to close. Me on the left, notebook at my side, Nina on the right, binder under her arm, jaw set, gaze fixed forward. No audio played at first. "Counsel," Elias said. "Audio channel is available and synchronized. Recommend full playback, then frame review." Rebecca nodded once. "Proceed." The room dimmed as Henry lowered the overhead lights for visibility. In the darkened reflection on the screen, I could see every person at that table watching themselves watch the footage. That doubled image felt accurate for corporate hearings, what happened, and how people perform having seen it. The elevator doors sealed, the timestamp advanced by 1 second. Nina moved first, not subtly, stepping out of her corner and into the center line between me and the control panel. Her shoulder turned toward me in a blocking angle, deliberate enough that even without audio the intent was legible. "Enable audio," Rebecca said. A soft mechanical hum filled the room, followed by the brushed metal echo of elevator acoustics. Then Nina's voice, unmistakable, low and close to the camera pickup, "You should have stayed in your lane." A pause. "I can remove you from this company by Friday." On screen, my posture remained still, hands visible, no forward movement. My response came in an even tone that sounded almost clinical to my own ears. "Please step aside." Nina leaned closer, lips tightening. "Do not test me." The car slowed at floor 37. The doors opened. I angled my body left, waited half a beat for clearance, and exited without touching her. The clip ended 9 seconds later with Nina still inside the car, expression hard, pressing a floor button with a short, sharp motion. No one spoke. Even the HVAC hums seemed louder now that language had done its work. Elias switched to a split screen. "For completeness, alternate angle E37-LOBBY-02. The second feed showed the doors opening from the hallway perspective. I appeared first at the threshold, pausing because Nina was occupying the center path. My right hand lifted slightly, palm angled inward in a non-contact gesture consistent with passing. I stepped around and exited. Nina remained in the car, then struck the close door button twice before the doors sealed. "No pursuing behavior," Elias said. "No raised arm movement from Ms. Barrett. No physical contact initiated by either party." Rebecca leaned toward her microphone. "Let the record reflect that video evidence contradicts the complainant's written allegation of cornering and threatening language by Ms. Barrett." She turned to Henry. "Tag clip 1 and clip 2 as exhibits. Lock distribution." Henry's fingers moved quickly now, with none of the earlier pauses. Beside him, Celia's pen hovered above her legal pad without touching it. Elias advanced to the telemetry page. Badge and proximity logs corroborate timeline. Both parties exited governance floor at 10:26:11. Elevator event window 10:26:29 through 10:27:04. Complaint intake initiated at 10:34 through Employee Relations Terminal. He clicked again. At 11:06:18, manual archive access request originated from Strategy Terminal STR-42-17 under Nina Caldwell credentials. No successful deletion completed, but request event is recorded. Legal hold propagation finalized at 4:58 after escalation. The numbers carried a force that emotion could not contest. Across the table, one governance observer cleared his throat, the same man who had asked if I could be intense. His earlier certainty had drained into procedural caution. "Mr. Trent, can credential misuse be excluded?" Elias answered without inflection. "Two-factor authentication token confirmed. Session time to active user presence at terminal. Misuse cannot be fully excluded in theory, but no anomaly flags indicate compromise." He let the sentence settle, then added, "The prevailing interpretation is direct user action." By the time the screen returned to the still frame of the elevator interior, it was 5:14 p.m., and the room no longer resembled the legal arena that had opened an hour earlier. It had become a documentation chamber, narrower and less forgiving, where each prior assumption had to be reconciled against a visible record. Rebecca capped her pen, uncapped it again, and addressed Nina for the first time since playback began. "Ms. Caldwell, do you dispute the authenticity of these exhibits?" Nina's lips parted, then closed. "I have concerns about context," she said. "Context was omitted from my written statement by necessity of brevity." Rebecca did not blink. Context does not permit false attribution of threatening language. Nina shifted in her chair, one hand at her throat, fingers pressing lightly beneath the collarbone, as if searching for air that would not catch. The colour had left her face in uneven patches, foundations suddenly visible at the jawline. "I reported what I experienced," she said, voice thinner now. "The atmosphere was coercive." She turned toward me then, as if my silence itself were an accusation. "You have a history of building pressure behind closed doors." I met her gaze and said nothing, because the footage had already answered the only question that mattered. Rebecca intervened before the exchange could widen. "This is not a character referendum. It is a fact determination." She tapped the complainant statement packet with 2 fingers. "Your filing states, quote, 'She cornered me and said, you'll regret this.' That language does not appear in the recording. Further, the recording captures you stating, quote, 'I can remove you from this company by Friday.' Why was that omitted?" Nina looked towards Celia, then Henry, then back to Rebecca, searching the table for an ally and finding process instead. "I did not believe that line was material," she said. Henry stopped typing for a fraction of a second, then resumed with a sharper keystroke pattern. One governance observer lowered his tablet entirely and stared at the tabletop, as if unwilling to be seen watching the collapse too directly. Celia finally wrote something, crossed it out, and wrote it again. Institutional silence has textures. This one was brittle. Elias remained standing near the screen, arms relaxed at his sides, a witness rather than an advocate. "For additional completeness," he said, "there is a hallway footage at floor 42 showing no contact before elevator entry and no visible agitation by Ms. Barrett in transit to the bank. Chain logs included in packet Appendix C." Rebecca nodded. "Admitted." She turned to me. "Ms. Barrett, for the record, do you wish to make a statement limited to the evidence presented?" I had imagined this moment in several forms, most of them louder than reality. What came out was simple. Yes, I requested preservation at first intake because I knew the event had been mischaracterized. The footage confirms I issued no threat. I asked that this finding be entered without qualification. "It will be," Rebecca said. Nina's breathing had become audible in the microphone range. Shallow pulls followed by careful exhalations she could not fully smooth. She reached for her water, missed the glass by an inch, then corrected, and took a sip that did not seem to help. The performance of composure she had carried through the afternoon was still present in outline, but not in function, like a stage set after the supporting frame has been removed. "I acted to protect myself," she said, "not to any one person. I had reason to fear retaliation." Rebecca responded with measured finality. Bad faith reporting is itself a policy violation, particularly when accompanied by attempted archive access during active complaint review. At 5:22, the door opened and 2 additional governance members entered quietly, having been briefed mid-session. They took seats against the wall, received digital copies of the exhibit index, and watched the clip in silence from the beginning. No one asked to hear Nina's narrative again. When the line "I can remove you from this company by Friday" played a second time, one of the later rivals looked up from his tablet and held that gaze on Nina for several seconds, long enough to signal not outrage but administrative consequence. In a setting built on hierarchy, that kind of look is a formal notice. Rebecca moved to determinations with the efficiency of someone aware that delay can be mistaken for indecision. "Preliminary findings for immediate action," she said into the record. 1. Allegation of threat by Ms. Barrett is unsupported by authenticated evidence and is dismissed effective now. 2. Interim restrictions on Ms. Barrett are rescinded pending written notice by close of business. 3. Complainant conduct is referred for bad faith reporting and retaliatory coercion review under Governance Policy 8.4 and Employee Conduct Standard 3.2. 4. Security Preservation Protocol concerns are escalated to Board Risk Committee for process audit. Henry read each line back for confirmation. She affirmed each one. Celia turned toward me, expressions strained by the collision of relief and liability. "Danielle, your floor access will be restored tonight once systems cycle." The sentence was practical, almost mundane, yet it landed in me with the force of oxygen after confinement. I nodded once. "Please send that in writing." She answered immediately. "I will." Nina tried to stand before Rebecca released the room, then sat back down when her knees failed to lock cleanly under her. Her hand trembled once near the edge of her binder, a small, involuntary motion that would have been easy to miss if the room were not so still. "I need counsel," she said. The earlier declarative authority was gone. What remained was procedural need. Rebecca gave a short nod. "You will have it. Remain available. Do not contact potential witnesses. Do not access security systems." Each instruction landed like a seal. The meeting formally adjourned at 5:31 p.m. No one rushed to the door. Papers were gathered slowly, devices disconnected with care, signatures captured on revised custody forms for the playback drive. Elias handed me a 1-page acknowledgement copy showing exhibit IDs and verification hashes, then said quietly, "Keep this with your records." It was the first direct sentence he had spoken to me all day, and it carried no sentiment, only respect for process done correctly. I thanked him and placed the sheet inside my folder behind the intake notice that had nearly buried me 6 hours earlier. As chairs scraped back and people filed out, Nina remained seated, staring at the dark screen where her own words had just been played into policy. Her face had the drained stillness of someone recalculating a map and finding no route that preserved the story she began with. No one approached her. No one offered the corridor performance of concern. The audience she had relied upon had not become moral. It had become evidentiary. In that room, that difference was decisive. I rose, collected my documents, and walked to the door without looking over my shoulder because reversal did not require triumph. It required record. I stepped into the corridor outside 33F with the exhibit packet under my arm and the bright orange visitor pass still clipped to my jacket, a badge of temporary suspicion that had outlived the accusation by 11 minutes. The carpet absorbed every footfall, but nothing softened the sensation of people recalculating me in real time. Henry passed on my left with a stack of binders held too tightly against his chest. He stopped, turned back a fraction, and said, "For what it is worth, your verbatim requests in 31B preserved the record." It was not an apology. It was an institutional acknowledgement, the closest form of contrition he had available. "Please include that in the final memo," I said. He nodded once and kept walking. At the security desk on 33, the compliance officer took my orange pass and scanned it out of the ledger. Your standard badge restore ticket is in queue, she said, voice neutral. Estimated cycle before 7 p.m. She slid a printed temporary clearance slip toward me, signed and time-stamped. I placed it behind the chain of custody acknowledgement Elias had given me. Paper against paper, sequence against sequence. In the elevator down, my reflection looked the same as it had at noon, only steadier around the mouth. By 6:12 that evening, I was back at my desk on 28 with 3 windows open. Celia's written rescission of interim restrictions, Rebecca Shaw's preliminary findings memo, and a security notice confirming legal hold across elevator video nodes, badge telemetry, and archive access logs. I printed all 3, hole-punched them, and inserted them in a black binder labelled Incident Record, Barrett. Then I opened my locked drawer and removed the hard copies I had built through the day. The intake packet, my preservation email, the custody receipt for Marisol's sealed envelope, and the compensation annotations from years earlier. I checked each page against its digital counterpart and wrote Verified 1819 in the bottom right corner of each one. Nothing remained loose. The floor was quieter now, post-commute quiet, monitors casting blue light over mostly empty desks. Jonah appeared at the edge of my aisle and stood there, waiting for permission that should have come from him hours ago. I should have said something in the room this morning, he said. His voice was formal, stripped of the easy collegial tone he used when he needed a model run quickly. You should have, I answered, not unkindly. He swallowed, looked at the binder in my hand, then at the carpet. I told myself, legal would sort facts. I closed the drawer. Facts do not sort themselves. People either preserve them or they don't. He nodded once and left. He didn't ask for absolution, and I did not offer it. At 6:47, an email arrived from corporate governance with subject line Notice of Administrative Action. It was brief, clinical, and final. Following evidentiary review, Nina Caldwell's employment was terminated for cause under Policy 8.4 and Conduct Standard 3.2. Access was revoked immediately. All strategy files under her control were frozen for forensic review. A second attachment listed required remediations, including an immediate audit of complaint handling protocol and an emergency recommendation session at 8:30 a.m. the next day. I was listed as required attendee, not observer. I forwarded the notice to my case folder and stood to walk 1 floor down to facilities records where Marisol was finishing her shift. The service corridor smelled of machine oil and citrus cleaner, exactly as it had when she handed me the envelope. She was at a high counter signing off maintenance tickets, reading glasses low on her nose. When she saw me, she set the pen down and waited. I placed a copy of the governance notice and the evidence receipt on the counter between us. Your log entry was admitted. Chain held. Findings were entered without qualification, I said. Marisol read the top page, then the second, and exhaled through her nose with quiet satisfaction. Good, she said. Then the system worked because someone forced it to. I thanked her again, and this time she accepted it with a small tilt of her head. I filed my own supplemental statement, she added. Time-stamped, signed. If they call, I will repeat it. Thread closed, not by sentiment but by record. The next morning opened under hammered steel clouds beyond the glass walls of 42. At 8:25 I entered the same boardroom where Nina had told me to sit down and where my deck had worn someone else's name. The brass nameplates were aligned as always, but the speaking order on the printed agenda had changed. My name appeared third after Chief Security and Outside Counsel before the Board Risk Committee Chair. The detail was small, visible, and corrective. Elias Trent presented first, standing at the far screen with the authentication packet projected in clean black text. He walked the room through every evidentiary artifact: the preserved footage, the hash verification, the 1106 manual archive access from STR-42-17, and the legal hold propagation delay that had created vulnerability. No embellishment, no theatrics. When he finished, the chair asked, "Any unresolved telemetry or custody gaps?" Elias answered, "None. All physical and digital items are accounted for in Appendix Index A through H." He turned one page. Original sealed media from facilities was transferred to Legal Evidence Locker 3B at 19:02 yesterday. Receipt is included. every physical item closed. Rebecca Shaw followed with findings. She addressed the room that had once accepted performance as proxy for truth. The complaint against Ms. Barrett was materially false. The filing constituted bad faith reporting and retaliatory conduct. Interim restrictions imposed on Ms. Barrett were rescinded in writing at 1803. We also identified procedural deficiencies, delayed hold propagation language, insufficient intake privacy controls, and over-reliance on subjective phrasing prior to evidence review. She paused. Recommended corrective governance actions are not optional. When my turn came, I stood without notes at first, then opened the black binder and placed 3 pages on the table: preservation request, timestamp, hold confirmation, and protocol gap summary. Yesterday's error was not only one person's misconduct, I said. It was a framework that allowed narrative to outrun evidence for most of a business day. The risk is enterprise-wide. I propose specific reforms in procedural language because policy changes survive where speeches do not. Automatic legal hold trigger within 15 minutes of any threat allegation, immutable access logs visible to security and governance simultaneously, private intake routing that removes public waiting exposure, mandatory verbatim transcription of both allegation and denial at first contact, and sanctions for unauthorized archive queries during active review. No one interrupted. The same enterprise risk observer who had questioned my legal understanding lifted his pen and asked, "Can operations risk lead implementation without conflict?" The question carried his answer inside it. "Yes," I said. "Implementation sits in my function already. Authority has simply been fragmented." The chair looked to the rest of the table, received silent assent, and spoke the line that settled the room. "Effective immediately, Danielle Barrett is appointed interim head of operational risk with direct reporting to this committee until permanent structure is approved." There was no applause. Governance does not clap. It records. The corporate secretary read the resolution into minutes, including the mandate for preservation reform and quarterly audits. Then the chair asked whether any board member objected. None did. After adjournment, people approached in careful sequence. Some offered concise congratulations. Some offered retroactive alignment. Evan Rees from Finance Operations reached me near the door and said, "Your version 14.2 model held under review. We used it exactly." He hesitated. "I should have asked a different question yesterday." I met his gaze. "Now you know which question matters." He nodded and did not defend himself further. Not everyone came over. The 2 associates who had whispered in the pantry passed by with files in hand and eyes forward. If they had anything to disclose, they never did. The recruiter who had watched the corridor scene offered a quiet "good morning" and kept moving. Loaded looks either become testimony or they dissolve into institutional memory. I noted both outcomes and moved on. At 11:10, I sat with HR, security, legal, and facilities in a smaller conference room on 31 and executed the final administrative closures. We signed the evidence disposition form transferring all preserved artifacts to locked governance archive with dual key access. We attached Celia's updated intake privacy protocol, now requiring closed-room staging for both parties from first notice. We logged Marisol's statement as corroborating infrastructure evidence and marked her messenger role resolved under compliance protection. We entered my external contact callbacks into the case appendix. Evan's call, security's responses, HR confirmations, all outcomes documented. Each thread was either concluded with action or marked as non-participatory witness behavior. Nothing remained implied. At 12:03, I returned to 42 for a short implementation kickoff with my new team. I looked around the table, some familiar, some newly attentive, and felt the old instinct to make myself smaller for the sake of room temperature. I let that instinct pass. "We are not building a culture of belief," I told them. "We are building a culture of proof. Those are different systems." Pens moved. Tasks were assigned. Deadlines were entered before anyone left the room. When I finally walked back through the executive corridor, the elevator motors hummed behind frosted glass as they had the day before, indifferent and constant. The building had not transformed into a fair place overnight. Power still preferred convenience. People still protected themselves first. But the record now contained my words in the places where decisions are made, and policy now carried safeguards born from what was done to me and what failed to erase me. I had spent years asking rooms like this to see me correctly. I no longer mistook visibility for safety. My name is Danielle Barrett, and that was the day I stopped asking to be believed and started requiring proof.